Hi, my name is Ben Curtis, and I'll be reading my paper entitled The Party as Corporate Agent. Christian List and Philip Pettit, in their book Group Agency, argue that the organizational structure of a group agent, or at least in part, grants the group a kind of agency. They distinguish between different organizational structures of group agents as functionally explicit or functionally inexplicit. In this paper, I argue that the Communist Party, as a group agent, has, or at least should be seen as closely resembling, a functionally inexplicit organizational structure. Based on this assessment, I will weigh in on List and Pettit's discussion on two topics. First, holistic supervenience between individuals and groups, and second, the autonomy of the group agent with respect to its members. Where they offer supervenience as an adequate explanation, I will suggest that the organizational structure of the party, as described by early 20th century Marxist theorists such as Vladimir Lenin or Georg Lukács, offer a more complicated and perhaps nuanced view in order to deepen this account of corporate group agency. List and Pettit distinguish between functionally explicit and functionally inexplicit group structures. A functionally explicit group structure is one that, quote, uses a given aggregation function, such as majority voting, applies its mechanically to the attitudes of its members, and then enacts the resulting group attitudes in an equally mechanical way, end quote. One example of this kind of mechanical aggregation function would be a simple majoritarian voting system in order to determine the preference and judgments of the group. Under such an aggregate model, the preferences or judgments of the group would be directly reducible to the preferences or judgments of the individual members of that group. A functionally inexplicit group, on the other hand, does not rely on this direct model of aggregation in order to determine the preferences or judgments of the group. Rather, quote, it involves a heuristic for determining, from proposition to proposition, the way for the group to go on, perhaps through deliberation, giving the group the flexibility to adjust its attitudes whenever appropriate. End quote. While this process may mimic some aggregation function, List and Pettit admit that it would be exceedingly complex. They hold that even with a functionally inexplicit group structure, the group attitudes generated, assuming non-random mechanisms of attitude formation, are still a function of the individual members of the group. In short, they identify an advantage in functionally inexplicit group structures, since it allows for more flexibility with respect to the mode in which group-level attitudes are determined. While it may be that the organizational structure of the party is not exactly one of a functionally inexplicit group structure, as we will see by the end of this section, it is certainly closer to it than a functionally explicit group structure. This is in part because of feedback mechanisms that accompany the functionally inexplicit model. List and Pettit identify 2 points about feedback mechanisms. First, they point out that feedback mechanisms allow individuals, when determining a group attitude, say about some proposition P, to be driven by preferences and judgments about whether it would be good for a group to adopt an attitude with respect to P, and not just to their own personal preferences or judgments about the issue in question. This means that individual group members of a group are able to take group-level attitudes and beliefs into account when making their individual decisions. Second, feedback mechanisms introduce a causal relationship between the individual level and group level phenomena. The attitudes of the individuals can cause the attitudes of the group to change, and vice versa. I argue that the organizational structure of the party would be functionally inexplicit. The party, on Lukács' view, must not be a mechanistically determined group, but rather flexible insofar as it responds to the material conditions of society. So consider the following quote. Thus, the ability to act, the faculty of self-criticism, of self-correction, and of theoretical development all coexist in a state of constant interaction. The Communist Party does not function as a stand-in for the proletariat, even in theory. Here, end quote. Here, Lukács focuses on the reflexive properties of the party, arguing that even theoretically, the party cannot stand in for the thoughts and attitudes of the proletariat. Rather, the party must maintain an internal faculty of adjustment or self-alteration. Lukács continues, quote, "If the class consciousness of the proletariat as a function of the thought and action of the class as a whole is something organic and in a state of constant flux, then this must be reflected in the organizational form of that class consciousness, namely in the Communist Party." End quote. The party, as the organized form of proletarian class consciousness, cannot be rigid or mechanistically determined, even by its own organizational structure. It must remain open, not only to the changing attitudes of its individual members, but also to the preferences and judgments of the proletariat as a whole. Here, the kind of quote-unquote heuristic involved is indeed complex, involving not only members of the group in question, that is the party, but also members of another group, that is individual members of the proletarian class, as well as the group attitudes of that group as a whole, that is to say, the attitudes of the proletariat as a whole. At the very least, this heuristic puts into question the aggregation function, since it seems difficult, if not impossible, to reduce the attitude of the party to the subjective attitudes of the individual members of the party. That is to say, the attitudes of the party members may be necessary, but not sufficient in determining the attitude of the group. Section 2. Holistic supervenience and the autonomy of the group agent. List and Pettit defend a supervenience relation between individual level and group level phenomena. Supervenience is a mode of determination in which lower level patterns relate to higher level patterns in multiple and complex ways. The notion of supervenience is a key concept for List and Pettit because, quote, "it leaves open the possibility that while the lower level patterns determine the higher level pattern may be realized in a number of lower level ways," end quote. This leaves open different arrangements or possible complex or nuanced combinations of individual group members in order to explain group level phenomena. Specifically, they defend a holistic account of supervenience. Holistic supervenience, according to List and Pettit, entails that, quote, "the set of group attitudes across propositions is determined by the individual sets of attitudes across these propositions," end quote. This kind of supervenience goes beyond proposition-wise supervenience, where the group attitude on a proposition is directly determined by the individual attitudes on that proposition, even if the mode of determination differs from proposition to proposition. Holistic supervenience is a relation in which the set of individual attitudes determine the set of group attitudes, but there is not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between the individual and group attitudes. This implies that knowing individual attitudes towards a proposition P is neither sufficient nor necessary for determining the group's attitudes towards P, resulting in weak autonomy or strong autonomy, respectively. Before turning to this notion of autonomy of group-level phenomenon, one aspect to note in List and Pettit's account is that the organizational structures they identify give rise to a holistic supervenience relation between the attitudes of individual members and those of the group are still homogeneous insofar as each member of the group plays the same role in determining the group's attitudes. This may at first seem at odds with a Marxist account of the party, since different members will inevitably play different institutional roles within the organizational structure. While this may be true, there is a kind of homogeneity across party members that keeps true to the kind of holistic supervenience that List and Pettit describe. Lenin, for example, maintains that a certain level of homogeneity among party members is required. Quote, "In view of this common feature of the members of such an organization, all distinctions between workers and intellectuals, and certainly distinctions of trade and profession, must be utterly obliterated." End quote. That is, while different members may fill different institutional roles, distinctions between so-called specialists must be dissolved in order for the party to function properly. Based on the notion of holistic supervenience, List and Pettit defend a moderate view of the autonomy of group agents. On their view, group agency that supervenes on its members is not, quote, ontologically autonomous, but rather epistemologically autonomous. That is to say, knowing the attitudes, beliefs, or desires of the group in question cannot be easily determined by simply knowing the attitudes, beliefs, or desires of the individual members of that group. Ultimately, List and Pettit argue that the group's attitudes can be derived from the attitudes of individual members in principle, although they admit that there are serious practical difficulties in doing so. While they explicitly defend a middle ground between emergentism and eliminativism, I argue that they side closer to the emergentist position, or at least what we might call an emergentist position, that aligns closely with the positions of Lenin, Lukács, or other early 20th century Marxist theorists. What List and Pettit ultimately reject from the emergentist position is an appeal to a vis vitalis, a life force or vital force, or an élan vital, which is something added to a group that gives its ontological status over and above its parts, as well as its relative autonomy. Taking at its word, they argue, quote, emergentism holds that the group agents are real entities whose properties as agents do not supervene on the contributions of their individual members. The emergentists held that the force by which a collection of individuals constitutes a group agent is an add-on to the individual contributions of the members. It is something that accompanies these contributions, but does not logically derive from them. End quote. According to List and Pettit, the emergentists speak in vague and elusive metaphors. They posit some mysterious force over and above the individual members. Emergentism and traditional Marxism. While I generally agree with List and Pettit's view of group agency, their rejection of emergentism is a bit too fast and too loose, and does not capture the complexity of positions, such as perhaps a traditional Marxist position, that might otherwise be described as emergentist. Both with respect to the general case of group agency, as well as the specific case of the group agency of the party, I agree with List and Pettit insofar as they reject any, quote, add-on force that contributes to the agency of the group. I draw generally from a Marxist method of dialectical materialism, which rejects the independence of a spiritual realm over and against the material realm. In this sense, I agree with List and Pettit in rejecting an appeal to some mysterious force that binds a group together on grounds that defy logic or reason. The traditional Marxist view, however, does not appeal to any such mysterious force. Rather, the kind of agency involved is perhaps confusing because, according to this tradition, the party is not a fully formed group, but is rather always in the process of becoming, evolving, and changing. Consider the following passage from Lukács. Quote, the party called upon to lead the proletarian revolution is not born ready-made into its leading role. It, too, is not, but is becoming. And the process of fruitful interaction between party and class repeats itself, albeit differently, in the relationship between the party and its members. End quote. Here, we might say that Lukács agrees with List and Pettit's position with respect to holistic supervenience. In the relationship between the party and its members, there is no strong ontological autonomy that implies complete independence of the group from its members. Rather, there is a reciprocal dialectical relationship between them. The party does not appear fully formed. It is not if the is designates an ontological entity completely apart from its constituent members. The group, as a group, is in a constant state of becoming. Despite the uniformity and continuity granted to it through its organizational and joint intentional structure, it is constantly evolving and changing. In light of the becoming of the party, it is easier to understand the following seemingly paradoxical statement from Lukács. Quote, Lenin's concept of organization is itself dialectical. It is both a product of and a conscious contributor to the historical development, insofar as it, too, is simultaneously product and producer of itself. If the party is a group already fully formed, then the claim that it is both product and producer itself makes no sense. If, however, it is the kind of group that is constantly changing, then it is continually developing and adjusting itself to its environment. This is another way of saying that there are feedback mechanisms at work in the organizational structure. Party members do not make decisions mechanistically. Their organization is functionally inexplicit and entails complex feedback mechanisms that include the party, the proletariat as a class, and society as a whole. This concept of the party, in turn, pushes against the explanatory limits of holistic supervenience, especially with respect to the kind of autonomy List and Pettit ascribe to it. On Lukács's view, the party does achieve a kind of autonomy or independence from the proletariat. However, it is not full or complete independence. And consider the following passage. Quote, The Communist Party is an autonomous form of proletarian class consciousness, serving the interests of the revolution. It is essential to gain a correct theoretical understanding of it in its twofold dialectical relation, as both the form of this consciousness and the form of this consciousness, that is to say, as both an independent and subordinate phenomenon, end quote. Here again, we can see that the party also plays a productive role, not only in terms of its own attitudes, beliefs, and desires, but also those of the class. The deeply relational or mediated and mediating nature of the party organizational structure thus seems to push at the limits of the explanatory power of the account of autonomy described by List and Pettit, providing a possible example from which to extend their account of group agency even further. So, in conclusion, in this paper, I have argued that the organizational structure of the Communist Party has group agency in the way that List and Pettit describe. Party members share intentions and make decisions through feedback mechanisms. I have suggested that the party form, at least insofar as it is described by Lukács, Lenin, and others, pushes against the explanatory limits of List and Pettit's account, particularly with respect to the becoming and not just the being of the group in question. Certainly, List and Pettit would not say that the agency arises magically or mysteriously all of a sudden. It is something that is developed, continued, and maintained over time. Thinking of the party as having a kind of agency that is becoming, rather than already fully formed, pushes against the limits of the explanatory power of their account in interesting ways. This is not to say that their account is wrong or misguided, just that more work is perhaps warranted in order to better understand the process of the development of group agency as not already fully formed, but continually becoming. In order to apply these abstract concepts to our own historical moment, the next practical move would be to look at our own society and ask, where is the party today? While perhaps this question is not especially commonplace, thinkers from Horkheimer and Adorno in the 1950s to Jodi Dean in her 2018 book, Crowds and Party, have investigated this question with respect to their own historical moment. What would be required, however, in order to apply these concepts to our own society would be to identify the function of the party form is intended to play, and to see if there are organizations that are continuing this struggle. Perhaps today there is no one unifying organization that fulfills all the roles of the party function, all the roles that the party function is supposed to play. However, if we look to labor unions, NGOs, and other non-profit organizations, one might see the possibility of uniting these disparate groups under one common fight or struggle, the class struggle of the proletariat. Thank you.